Excellencies, Ministers, Your Excellencies, Heads of Delegation, and distinguished guests, good evening. I will present a summary of the communiqué of the International Cooperation Forum and Meeting of African Ministers of Finance, Economy, and Environment, held from the 7th to the 9th of September at the Al Masa Convention Center at the new administrative capital in Cairo, Egypt. The summary will not represent the entire text, but it will represent the key points which have been agreed by ministers as key messages to be presented at COP27 as priorities for African countries, in particular towards unlocking climate finance in an equitable manner to address the urgency of the climate crisis. First of all, expressing our gratitude to His Excellency the President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi and the government of Egypt for having hosted the event and ensured all the necessary conditions for the successful completion of its work, which was marked by fruitful and high-quality discussions on the monitoring and evaluation of the progress achieved, exchange of experiences in the areas of climate finance in Africa, and the formulation of key messages aimed at accelerating a just and holistic implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and its Sustainable Development Goals, Agenda 2063, the Africa we want of the African Union, as well as of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement. The communiqué acknowledges the urgent need for reliable and predictable sources of climate finance for African countries. The communiqué considers the disproportionate impact of climate change and nature loss on the African continent, recognizing its low carbon footprint and low contributions to the phenomenon of climate change, but recognizing also the opportunity of African countries to invest in a climate resilient future. The communiqué also points out Africa's role in carbon sequestration and the great importance of carbon sinks on the African continent. It recalls the significant development financial needs of the continent, which have been exacerbated by the COVID-19 crisis and by the food and energy crisis associated with the war in Europe. It recalls that African countries have already made very ambitious commitments through their nationally determined contributions, totaling up to $3 trillion by 2030. It underlines the need for continued ambition through nationally determined contributions from all countries and the need for nationally determined contributions to be updated, reflecting the urgency of the climate crisis. It is deeply concerned by the worsening macroeconomic conditions affecting African countries, marked by high inflation, rising global interest rates, decreasing fiscal revenues, capital flight, and the associated deterioration of domestic capital markets, and recognizing that African countries are the least responsible for this deterioration of macroeconomic fundamentals, while having the least tools to respond. Deeply concerned as well on the various intertwined social, economic, environmental effects of climate change and the depletion of the continent's natural capital. Underlining the high vulnerability of African countries, in particularly least developed countries, landlocked countries, and small island developing states, and their limited capacities to address the impacts of climate change. And recalling that Africa receives less than 5.5% of climate financing, most of which is dependent on official development institutions. The communiqué also aims to capitalize on the growing interest of institutional investors, such as those represented by the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, in investing in the emerging opportunities on the African continent for climate resilience, and also acknowledges the critical role of multilateral climate funds in achieving investment for climate resilience. It stresses the need to scale up investments towards climate adaptation and mitigation, address loss and damage, and highlighting the importance of improved access to quality and quantity of climate financing, leaving no one behind, underpinning an ambitious and realistic, actionable climate agenda that is rooted in the principles of justice and equality. In terms of the action areas identified for COP27 under the communiqué, Firstly, the communiqué reaffirms the focus on mobilizing resources for resilience and establishing a new collective goal on climate finance. It reiterates the need for commitments made under the UNFCCC process to be achieved and these engagements to be honored. It strives to enhance Africa's resilience and adaptation capacity to achieve the global goal on adaptation, calls on African countries to strengthen their own institutional arrangements to enhance efforts to adapt to the effects of climate change, urges developed countries to fulfill their pledges, in particular on the mobilization of the 100 billion, and requires all unfulfilled commitments to be honored as soon as possible. In terms of the setting of the new collective goal on climate finance, the new goal should be based on the needs identified by developing countries in their nationally determined contributions and as reflected in the needs report, and no less than 2% of global GDP additional to the official development assistance commitments and decadal and annual financing goals linked to pledges and actions of developed countries as requested in the Paris Agreement and based on the urgent needs and priorities of developing countries. The second main action area is reducing the cost of green borrowing and the enabling role of international financial institutions and multilateral development banks. The communiqué calls on all partners to urgently operationalize the financials, to make use of the Financial Stability Board and to operationalize the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, and also engage in other innovative financing mechanisms. It underscores the need for liquidity for African countries that are fiscally constrained and calls for a new issuance of SDRs to give capacity for African countries to deal with the various emergencies, including the current climate emergency. It supports the work of the International Sustainability Standards Board to introduce a global baseline of sustainability disclosures to meet the needs of capital markets. It stresses on the role of using concessional finance and grants in blended finance vehicles as a catalyst for private capital by creating fiduciary investment assets to improve risk-return ratios and aiming to upscale African engagement and participation in the issuance of green, social, and sustainability bonds through mechanisms such as the Liquidity and Sustainability Facility. It calls upon development partners to foster simplification and harmonization of ESG criteria. Some of the specific messages for multilateral development banks: first of all, to provide meaningful debt for sustainable investment options and refinancing in line with climate needs, and addressing suspension for countries that are experiencing loss and damage events. Requesting that the maturity of debts be extended and affordable interest rates be applied to support urgent and effective climate resilient investment. Increasing the risk appetite of multilateral development banks to focus on the costs of transition risks. Mandate new and urgent capital increases for multilateral development banks associated with additional climate finance. Increase the multilateral development bank private sector leverage ratios. Double the scale of replenishment of the incoming GCF replenishment. Facilitate the deployment of new financial instruments, particularly non-debt instruments, policy-based guarantees, and options that do not require sovereign guarantees. And incorporate innovative financing mechanisms initiated and led by African countries. The next action point relates to debt and the linking of debt to climate resilient key performance indicators. The communiqué requests the Economic Commission for Africa to present a proposal to establish a sustainable sovereign debt hub that addresses 4 interlinked aims of reducing the cost of capital for developing countries, in particular by building harmonization on the deployment of blended resources. Secondly, supporting the opportunity to undertake debt for climate adaptation or nature swaps or refinancing to reduce the debt stock of African countries and stimulate ambitious action on climate. Thirdly, making sovereign debt markets more responsive to climate change and nature needs, and addressing the underlying needs of countries facing financing challenges in the context of exogenous shocks. Fourthly, building capacity and developing policy frameworks and facilitating the issuance of debt instruments using key performance indicators to better channel resources into sectors that are critical for climate resilience. The fourth priority area, financing a just and equitable transition and delivering implementation. The communiqué underscores the need for a just and equitable transition, recognizing the different needs of African countries and other emerging economies. It urges the COP27 CMA4 to agree a comprehensive mitigation package based on ambitious action and leadership by developed countries. Encourages governments to consider multilateral country platforms to accelerate the transition towards a low-carbon, resilient and inclusive economy, to create momentum for climate financing on the local level, and examples such as Egypt's country platform for the Nexus of Water, Food and Energy Program is identified as a positive example, or the NWEFI example. The fifth priority area is financing adaptation, and it requests the operating entities of the financial mechanisms of the UNFCCC, in particular the Green Climate Fund, to facilitate access of African countries to adaptation finance, while welcoming the support provided for the preparation of adaptation plans. It calls on multilateral development banks to increase their assistance to support African countries' work on adaptation. It welcomes the new CIF finance program for nature-based solutions, calls on African countries and their development partners to strengthen regions' capacity to scale up investment in sustainable biodiversity, land and ocean management, international frameworks, and regional frameworks. The sixth major action point is enhancing sustainable regional value chains for food security. It calls for the enhancement of synergies to unlock green and blue industrial development for the private sector through development of integrated sustainable value chains in the context of the African Continental Free Trade Area. It aims to strengthen cost-effective investments and implementation at scale around food security and agriculture for both adaptation and mitigation, and aims for early action and protection of the most vulnerable through safety nets, insurances, social protection, and resilient infrastructure, nature-based solutions, including land rehabilitation, climate-smart agriculture, a focus on healthy and sustainable diets, and access to markets through the AFCFTA. Seventh area of priority is facilitating development and access to high-integrity carbon markets. And all parties are called upon to establish an ambitious carbon market aligned with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. The communiqué also calls for the support of development of capacity of African countries to use carbon markets as a means to stimulate investment in climate resilience and raise revenues, such as through the ECA-supported initiative for a common registry for the Congo Basin. The eighth area of focus is on capacity building and capacity development and institutional support. It aims to support the creation of climate finance units in the African Ministries of Finance to facilitate and improve access to climate financing. It underlines the need for the deployment of data and concrete investment plans, integration of climate action strategies in national development priorities, and access to technology and the development of robust monitoring and reporting systems. It supports the development of capacity and institutionalization of a sustainable budgeting approach, integrating climate goals within national fiscal frameworks. It calls upon all stakeholders to adopt gender-sensitive strategies in their response to climate change and to mobilize accordingly for the necessary finance to avail economic opportunities for women. It aims to promote investments in technical assistance and capacity building, complemented by efficient market-based policies and instruments. And in conclusion, the communiqué calls upon all countries to convey these key messages of the Egypt International Cooperation Forum and the meeting of African Ministers of Finance, Economy and Environment at COP27 to be held in Sharm el-Sheikh. Thank you very much. Shukran.